Alright everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name's Nice. Let's get started. So, this is the remake for my original Mesa Consume build video. This is going to include the updates and what changes I've made, and it's going to be, just like before, it's going to be an in-depth build guide. We're going to be going over literally everything about the build. Just a reminder, this is a build for beginners. Not necessarily for beginners, but we're not going to be going incredibly in-depth in terms of like hyper-optimizing. This is a build meant to get you started and get you clearing the Exalted Tower. Now, go through and give you a quick overview of the build. We're using a Blade of Conquest. I'll go over what stuff is important, what stuff isn't important later. For now, I'm just going to go through and show you my gear. In case of you're a more experienced player, you kind of already know how all this stuff works, and you're just looking to see what gear and stats I'm using. You know, you can go ahead and look at them while I'm showing them to you now. Now, that said, I do want the main takeaway you get from this to be more of how to make a build, more so than how to copy paste a build, especially if you're a newer player. I don't think just simply copy pasting a build really does you that much good. So just to mention, the shards for this build are going to be Dust of the Earth and Avalanche Technique. Avalanche Technique did not get patched in the recent patch, so this is still just as good as it used to be, so we are still using it. And here's my skill tree if you just want to copy paste that. And so just to mention, this is a poison consume build. I am relying on the Ascendant passive to consume currently on this build, although I also have the shield bash and blending bash filled in just in case I want to use them. And I think that's going to do for a quick overview of the build. So first things first, let's go ahead and give you a quick showcase of the build's damage. So first things first, I just want to show you the sort of baseline damage you can expect out of this build with stats like mine. You have worse stats, you'll do less damage. You have better stats, you'll do more damage. But with my Northern Technique, I get about 260,000 damage. With my Southern Technique, I get about 155 damage. And once I get my my Avalanche Technique fully charged, my Avalanche Technique does about 4.9 million damage when I consume it. Now that said, don't worry if you can't get stats like mine. Even with much worse stats, you can still do tons of damage with Avalanche Technique in particular, especially, I guess I should say. Even with like, I think 250 element power and duration, I think you still do over 3 million damage with Avalanche Technique. And remember, this is without, without the Poison Cloud, without your banner, nothing. This is just your baseline damage. Mesa's very, very strong. Avalanche Technique is crazy strong, so it's kind of hard to not get decent damage out of her as long as you're building her correctly. And now let's sort of gonna start showing you some of those things. For example, the banner and the cloud. So I've spawned 2 enemies here, and we're working with 2 enemies because 2 bosses spawn in the Exalted Tower at the start of the boss board. So I figured 2 enemies is a good number of enemies to show this with. We'll mention that the actual Poison Cloud attack when you apply it does actually do a fairly strong element. For me, it does about 200,000 damage. And you can see we did 730,000 damage out of that. So our actual Northern Technique did about 530,000 damage, as you can see. Or it just ran out. It ran out in the middle of it. So I'll just show it to you again so you can see. And just for consistency's sake, I suppose. Very, very strong the Poison Cloud is. Definitely don't underestimate it. It's very common to get more than 2 enemies included in a Poison Cloud proc in the Exalted Tower. Well, I guess he still has the initial proc on him. Let me get a new one. Let me get a new Decimus. As you can see, no inconsistency here. It's at about 500,000 damage. Very, very strong. Absolutely busted the Poison Cloud is. And with obviously with more enemies hit by it, it does even more damage. And now let's sort of show you off, or show off, including the banner as well. Let me get a fresh Decimus here. Don't mess up my consumes. Let me get a fresh Decimus. Put the banner down. And with just the banner, I do 360,000 damage. Just the banner. Now, if I include the Poison Cloud on top of the banner, as you can see, and remember this also includes the initial hit, I go up to 1 million damage with 1 Northern Technique and the initial Petrifying Slam, so about 800,000 damage with my Northern Technique. Poison Cloud is very strong. And just to show you my banner, I do have a pretty good banner. I've got 120% element power on this banner. Very, very strong. Don't worry if you don't have one this good. You don't need it. It's pretty overkill, to be honest. But if you can get something like this, obviously it's really good. And just to show you my stats, I have 362, I believe, element duration and 364 element power. If you're wondering where that's coming from, the zero thing, I have this. This does not show up on your stat sheets, and neither does Mesa's Exalted passive, which gives me 30% poison power. So I'm actually at 362% duration and 364% power. Very, very even. Minor, as a general bit of advice, you do want even element power duration. We'll go more into that later. And I think that'll about do it for the showcase. And now we'll go and start talking about the shards more in depth. So the choice of shards for this build is going to be Dust of the Earth, Poison Cloud, and Avalanche Technique, the Vengeance Meter Attack. So starting off with Dust of Cloud, this is incredibly strong. This is a very, very large source of your consumed damage. This will really jack up your damage. This is kind of a must-have on pretty much any Mesa build. Nobody really forgoes this, although I suppose you could. But again, very, very strong, and we are using this. And we are using Avalanche Technique. This shard is incredibly busted, and fortunately did not get nerfed in the most recent patch. Now, that said, one thing to mention if you're kind of skipping around through the video, this only applies in elements if you have weapon techniques and focus elements on your weapon. We'll cover more about that in the actual weapons section, but just want to mention that you do have to do that, right? So the way this works is pretty simple. I believe it takes like 1.5 million-ish damage to consume damage to max it out, something like that. I did the math a while ago. I don't remember what it is. Pretty sure it's about 1.5 million consumed damage to max this out, which might seem like a lot, but it's actually not very difficult to do on Mesa. And that's about all there is to really talk about shards. These shards are pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Except for this needing a specific version of weapon techniques and focus elements. So again, that's it for the shards. Now let's go and talk about the skills. So you do have a fair bit of wiggle room on your skills. There are a few things you're going to want for sure. Obviously, you're definitely going to want 5 points in weapon techniques, and you're going to want 5 points in weapon timing attacks, especially because you do absolutely want the weapon technique timing attack from the 5th point. Now that said, critical hit chance, critical hit damage, you also want. Thundering Slam, you don't need this maxed out. I like to have it though. But honestly, the rest of this is, most of this is pretty up to preference. The one thing I do really want to talk about though is this 5th point in elements. So Shield Bash and Spinning Blast consume elements. Now on Mesa, you do not need this because obviously you get the Ascendant passive. Now I like to have this as a sort of backup way to consume in an emergency. Now on Mesa, you do use your shield meter for petrifying slams. So this can be a detriment for your Poison Cloud shard, but in a pinch, this can be nice. And I had the wiggle room to take it anyways, while also taking everything else I wanted. Polarity attacks and stuff like that. I got everything I wanted, and I got an extra method to consume if I really need it. Even all of the points for Spinning Blast as well. Again, that said, if you don't want that, and honestly you really don't need it, there's no real use. Feel free to do with your points as you wish. You have a lot of wiggle room here. Just the kind of must-haves are obviously weapon techniques, weapon timings. You're obviously going to want crit hit chance, Archon Fury, resistances of course, and at least 4 points in elements. The rest is pretty much up to you to take as you wish. And that's really about all there is to talk about skills. Now let's go and get into the actual gear, starting with the weapons. So let's start talking about the weapons. So the first things first, you are going to be using a longsword for this build, and there is one specific thing you need on this longsword, and that is weapon techniques inflicts elements. You do need this on your longsword. There are a few options for this. Obviously, you can use a Blade of Conquest or a Sword of Dominance, the double primary longsword. Unfortunately, the longsword that normally comes with this effect does only drop, and I believe it's air. Let me double check that. Yes, the not the rosary. The sincerity. There it is. Yes, this only drops as an air DPS sword, unfortunately. So you aren't going to be able to use an epic sword for this. But there is a blue weapon called the Stinger. I don't think I actually have one. I checked before I made the video, and I don't have one on hand, unfortunately. But the Stinger is a blue weapon. You can find it anywhere, and it just has the line weapon techniques and fixed elements. Get yourself an Earth DPS Stinger, and that will work just fine for the build. Otherwise, your options are a double or triple primary longsword. Your priorities for this are going to be the weapon techniques and fixed elements effect, and blessing of luck or greater blessing of luck. These are going to be your priorities. If you can get something like this, but you know, if this was, imagine this was Earth DPS, right? This would be like pretty much the best primaries you could get for this build. This is what I'm currently using as best I've got. I will mention that the Rosary effect, the 15% Northern Tech charge when you hit it in Northern Technique, is really, really good right now, especially after the nerf to Lion Talisman. Something like this is really, really good. Obviously, I'd prefer a better secondary stat. You do want to try and get as much crit chance as you can get for the sake of consistency with Lion Talisman for your, your weapon technique charge. But those are your options. Just remember, it's either a sort of either a Blade of Conquest, a Sword of Dominus, or a blue Stinger that you can find anywhere. You can just like farm Dreamstones for blue longswords or something, right? For rare longswords. And eventually you'll get one. Just grab yourself an Earth Neo, try to get yourself a decent roll. Now for our offhand weapon, I'm going to recommend using a polearm with greater blessing of endurance on it. Doesn't really too much matter what else is on it. I really only use this to do polarity attacks and get greater blessing when I feel like I need it. Now, in terms of the element for your offhand polearm here, you actually have a few options. It doesn't need to be the earth element. It can be so there's really two options, or three options. There's earth, there's physical, and there's void. Physical will get you a little bit of extra base damage. Honestly, you're probably not going to notice it that much on this build because of how much element consume damage you do. But void damage on the other hand, and which just so happens to be pretty convenient with Spirit Bearer, although doesn't this roll in multiple elements? I'm not sure, to be honest. Anyways, either just any Spear of Fate or Sunfire Destiny, or a Spirit Bearer will do for your offhand. So just a reminder, Void will get you some extra survivability with Curse because cursed enemies do less damage to you. And physical will get you a little bit of extra damage. And personally, I'm just rolling this physical one. Honestly, I'd probably switch to a Void one, to be honest, because you really don't need the extra damage on this build. Yeah, let me go ahead and do that. So yeah, let me recommend a Void polearm offhand personally. And that's going to be it for the weapons. Honestly, you can really use whatever you want in this offhand slot. I just like having access to greater blessing and endurance for some extra survivability, some extra padding. But that is entirely up to you. Use a great hammer. You can use a war hammer or something like that, whatever you want. And that's going to be it for the weapons. Just remember, I know I'm going over this a lot, but you do need weapon techniques and fixed elements on your weapon. And that's either going to be from a double or triple primary, or the rare weapon, or rare longsword, Stinger. And that's it. Now, let's go ahead and start talking about the amulet now. Now, if you're a newer player, I'm going to recommend you just grab yourself a Grandmaster Station. This is going to allow you to apply Mark of Weakness when you inflict an element, and this is going to make enemies deal less damage to you. This is a very, very powerful survivability tool, but I will say you do have some other options. For example, especially if you're a more experienced player, you can get a Colossus Legacy. Well, let me go over this first. The other real option here for a new player for consistency is the Amulet of the Betrayer. This just simply prevents you from dying once every 10 minutes. It's pretty nice and can save you from some one-shot situations. If you're a more experienced player and you have a Colossus Legacy with both of those effects, so remember, you can have both the Grandmaster Station effect, the Mark of Weakness, and the keep you from dying effect on a Colossus Legacy. If you happen to have one of those, that's going to be really good. Just a quick reminder, the Amulet slot is one of the few slots where you can get a critical hit chance secondary stat, and you definitely do want to do that. just to get as much consistency as you can get on this build in terms of your critical hits. Just keep that in mind. Now, if you're not too worried about survivability, you also have the option of the Pendant of Lavas. This will get you some extra consume damage, but honestly, my personal opinion, you don't really need it. But if you really want it, you really just want those big numbers, you can get it right there. And honestly, it's not really that bad. My personal recommendation, try to go for a Vitality Amulet to get the plus 6% to all resistances on the Mastery. This is going to be nice for you, because resistances are very important in the Exalted Tower. They will definitely keep you from dying. But those are kind of your main options. Just remember, either a Grandmaster Station, an Amulet of the Betrayer, a Pendant of Lavas, or if you're a more experienced player, you can go for a Colossus Legacy. But with, you know, both the Amulet of the Betrayer and the Grandmaster Station effect. Now that said, before we do move on to Charm, I do want to mention another option if you do just want to get as much damage as you can get. And let's say you're running Pendant of Lavas instead of the Grandmaster Station or something like that. And this is more of a more experienced player's thing. If you have a Mephra Star with both the Lion Talisman effect and the Mark of Fragility effect, you can put this on. If you have a better one than I have and you have crit chance on the secondaries, I would recommend it. This will boost your damage tremendously. You will hit so hard, you will do so much damage. Mark of Fragility is really strong in terms of damage output, but that's just remember, you can only have one mark on an enemy at a time, so you cannot have both Mark of Weakness and Mark of Fragility, so you do have to choose one or the other right there. But now that we're done talking about that, let's actually go and start talking about the charm more in depth. So for your charm, you kind of only have one real option, unless you do happen to have some various, basically there are some exceptions, but generally if you're a new player, your primary option is going to be the Lion Talisman. This is just simply the main way you're going to maintain your weapon technique charge, which is very important for both your damage and your survivability. It's kind of very hard to forgo this in a build. Especially if you do want that build to be consistent. Lion Talisman is incredibly strong even after its nerf. Now, in the previous section, I did mention one case where you might want to run Mark of Fragility if you just want as much damage as you can get. But remember, you cannot run Mark of Weakness if you want to do this, but this will give you a lot more damage. So if you do have a Mephra Star with like both of these effects, and you have a secondary crit chance on it, just a reminder, this is another one of your very few slots, aka just your weapon, your amulet, and your charm, where you can get a critical hit chance secondary line. And for the Lion Talisman, you can get the critical hit chance on the mastery as well. So obviously critical hit chance is your primary priority here. The rest of it, element power, element duration, would be good, and you definitely want the critical hit chance secondary as well. Now your other option, now I do want to kind of get into some of those unique cases, right? Beetle Talisman can be used, but generally only if you have a double primary augment that's going to give you the effects of both where is it, Paradise and Spark, which is the weak points version of this. If you can get that, you can run both Paradise and Spark and that double primary augment, and you can stack those to have enough weapon technique charge to get away with using Beetle Talisman. This will give you a ton of AoE on this build, but if you're a newer player, I doubt you have access to something like that, and honestly it is a little overkill. So I would personally just recommend you get yourself a Lion Talisman, get a crit chance secondary, get crit chance on the mastery, and that'll be good enough for the build. And that's about all there really is to talk about charms. Now let's go and start talking about the rings. Now for your rings, you actually have quite a bit of flexibility. So I'm using the Mikalai's Help, which I would highly recommend for this build, and the Sanguine Ring, which is kind of pretty much a freebie slot. Since we don't need weapon techniques and plus elements on our ring because we get it from our weapon, and not only that, we must get it from our weapon, so we don't need something like the Eye of the Dragon. But the Mikalai's Help is very strong. This might not seem that good at first glance to 22 overhealth for every 1,000 damage dealt, but when you actually consider how much element consume damage you're doing, This basically ends up maxing out your overhealth meter every single time you consume, and we'll mention that is affected by your overhealth gain percentage. Very, very strong ring, tons of overhealth generation every time you consume. And again, with this build, you are consuming basically constantly. I will mention I do have the Void Shell augment and the Focus augment, which are both augments that generate overhealth whenever you get a critical hit. But those are basically just for topping off my overhealth for whenever I can consume for whatever reason. The Equalize Hell is my primary method of overhealth generation. Now, the Sanguine Ring is something I'm using purely for damage. This normally drops as a green ring. I have a primal version of it. As you can see, I have element power and duration on mine, and it's got a nice juicy 50% element power on the primary stack thanks to that primal status. A very, very strong ring. If you can get something like this yourself, this is very, very good. Now, as for your actual secondaries on these, you do want to prioritize element power and duration, and on your vitality ring, you do want to get plus 5% to all resistances. Again, resistances are very, very important. You want to get as much as you can. But other than that, you're just looking for element power and duration. And that's about it. Now, again, you have a lot of wiggle room on these. If you don't want to use Equalize Hell, and since you are, if you're following my build, you are already going to be using Void Shell and Focus. If you're fine with those as overhealth generation by themselves, you have a lot of options. I mentioned earlier that there is the Eye of the Dragon, which gives you a little bit of extra overhealth generation on enemy kill, with some retention, and is generally a pretty good ring. If you can get something like this, it's pretty good. There's plenty of options. I don't know if they actually fixed this, but the last time I checked, the Heavenly Reversal did not increase your damage on Mesa. I guess the Ascendant passive overwrites this primary effect for whatever reason. I would double check that to be sure. I don't think it works, but even if it does work, I probably wouldn't bother with it anyways. Another good option is the Mark of the Red Armor. This is a very, very strong ring. The Lifestone recovery applied as overhealth is actually a much more useful effect than you might expect, and it comes with a very, very juicy 100% or more overhealth gained just built into it. Again, lots of options. If you really wanted to, you could use something like the Duskwort Ascendant. I mean, there's no real reason to use this. This isn't really raw damage build, so the weak points don't really help you at all. But I guess if you really wanted to, you could. But again, I'm going to recommend Equalize Hell and the Sanguine Ring. Again, this drops as a green ring you can find anywhere. Very easy to get. Just roll one until you get a good roll, right? And again, Mark of the Red Armor, also very, very good. And that kind of about covers it for the rings. Now let's go ahead and start talking about the stone and the banner. So as always, I don't really care about my stone, and I try not to rely on my stone effect, but I kind of don't really recommend you do the same. Don't be lazy like me. And instead, for this build, you're probably going to want to use something like, let me find it real quick. I think I passed it. Oh no, there it is. The Radiant Pearl, which gives you earth damage, or the Bead of the Hardened Ethereum, which gives you element power. Now, I personally just don't like to rely on my my Lifestone effects, but for your substance for these, you do want to prioritize element power and duration as per usual, and you're going to get pretty used to that on this build. But other than that, honestly, it doesn't really matter that much. You're not going to have these effects very often, and they only last for 10 seconds. Now, for your banner, on the other hand, is much more important. You are going to want to use a Plague Pennant, and you do again want to prioritize element power and duration. This is the best option I have. But if you can get something of both element power and duration on it, that will be fantastic for your build. Very, very strong banner. Nothing else really comes close to it for this build. Definitely want to use the Plague Pennant. Again, element power and duration for the substats on it. That's going to be about it for the stone and the banners. Now let's go ahead and start talking about the augments. So for your augments, you do have a lot of wiggle room. Before we get into the specifics, I do want to mention a reminder. Again, you do want to keep your elements as balanced as possible to get the most damage. In most situations, there are exceptions, but in general terms, if you're a newer player, just go for as even as you can get. Quick reminder, and this is one of the augments I'm going to recommend for certain. Augments like this are not reflected in your stat sheet. Neither is a passive like the Exalted Mesa passive. So when you look at your stat sheet, you do have to factor those in. So my actual element power and duration is 362% duration and 364% power. So just keep that in mind. And the augments is going to be the easiest place where you can do your stat balancing. And that's why I bring this up here in particular. But again, let's go ahead and get into it. So Twilight Bloom, again, very, very strong augment. You do definitely want this. Bloom is, or Glamour is also very, very strong. Not as important as Twilight Bloom, but it's pretty easy to fit on this build. I do highly recommend it. Again, circling back to Azure Fang, this is a very strong augment. For a 5-cost augment, this is kind of a no-brainer. It's hard to pass this up. This is, the primary effect alone is a net 70% Ember power / duration. Very, very good. Definitely don't recommend you pass this up. Force Barrier is honestly not mandatory, but I just personally cannot live without it. Very, very good augment. Very useful for whenever you need to do some normal attacks or something to top off your weapon meter for whatever reason. And I do want to mention for these Vitality augments in particular, you definitely do want to get the All Resistances Mastery over anything else. Again, resistance is very, very important. You do want these. So Glamour, Force Barrier, Void Shell, very, very useful augment in general, but especially just for keeping your overhealth topped up all the time. Very nice. Again, element power and duration are your primary or priority secondary stats. Now, I use Fortitude because I'm not running Eye of the Dragon. I personally just like to have some overhealth retention in my build, at least just a little bit. I kind of hate when I have like no overhealth retention and my overhealth just drains instantly, but this is pretty much a free slot. You could do whatever you want with this slot right here. I just like to have some overhealth retention. Now, you do definitely want a Paradise. This is a great way to get some more weapon technique charge running from a critical hit. Ironheart is not mandatory, but is very, very useful for the crit chance. I would leave this up to your personal discretion if you feel like you need this or not. This is going to depend on your how much crit chance you have on your weapon. As you can see, I've only got, I don't have a main crit chance line on my sword, and neither do I have Greater Blessing on it. So I've opted to run Ironheart to boost up my crit chance a little bit. But if you've got better crit chance substats than I do, this is not mandatory. You can switch this for something else. Say, I can't remember what it's called, but they're in the augment that generates weapon technique charge when you kill an enemy. That could be a useful slot in on this build. Focus, very, very useful augment once again. It's kind of a nice combo of Void Shell. Even more overhealth generation on critical hit. Kind of an easy slot in. And that about covers it for the augments. Again, you do have a lot of wiggle room here. You kind of can do switch out a lot of these things depending on your personal preference. My recommendations of things you keep absolutely for certain are going to be Twilight Bloom, Azure Fang, and Paradise. I would recommend you have these no matter what, especially with Twilight Bloom, because what else are you going to put here in these 3 red augments, right? Glamour is a bit more debatable because you don't have 3 green augments in a row here, and they can be whatever you want. But again, Glamour very strong. This is kind of a must recommend, but not necessary. Again, this Twilight Bloom, Azure Fang, Paradise, definitely get those for sure. But the rest is entirely up to you, depending on your needs. And now that we've done that, let's sort of go into the playstyle. We're kind of done talking about the gear part of the build, and now we're going to talk about sort of the build, the place, I guess the playstyle of the build. Let's get into it. The playfiles for this build is thankfully very, very simple. There isn't really too much you have to keep track of, other than your Poison Cloud cooldown. It's probably the main thing you need to keep track of, right? And that's pretty simple to do. Because you'll pop your Poison Cloud down. Look for good opportunities to do that as much as you can. Thankfully, you don't need any shield generation on this build to have 100% uptime on your Poison Cloud. Well, when I say uptime, I mean your shield charge will be back before your Poison Cloud cooldown is over, right? And really, you're just doing Northern techniques. You do pretty much always want to do a timing attack after your Northern technique. You don't have to do one after your Southern technique. I tend to do it just partially out of habit, partially out of just being cautious. But you really don't need to, but definitely going to want to do a timing attack after your northern techniques. And that's pretty much it for regular enemies. If you find yourself in a bit of a sticky situation, you can pop your polarity attack, you'll get your blessing of endurance up, and that'll help give you a nice chunk of survivability. Now for boss rooms, again, a reminder, at the end of an elevator trial, you do want to try to make sure you have an avalanche technique already ready to go. And generally the way you're going to want to start boss fights is to essentially run in, charge your Sundering Slam as the bosses are about to spawn, put your banner down, use your shield, and then just start doing damage. You can also pop Arcane Fury in there if you want to as well to get even more damage. But you should be, at this point, not lacking any damage at all. Luckily, this build's very, very simple. Pretty much all you really need to keep track of is the cooldown of your shield, which is, again, very simple to do, as you can see it ticking away in the bottom left, although the hint thing is kind of blocking it. I need to check and see if you can turn this off. As you can see, now it's back. And yeah, just try to make sure you get into the boss room with Avalanche Technique ready to go. Honestly, you don't really need to worry about it that much. Again, just a quick mention, if you don't know, if you're a player, the longsword weapon techniques and the follow-up timing attack is completely immune to damage. So you're completely invulnerable to this entire animation. This as well. I messed with the timing attack. Yeah, all this is iframes, including this. It's all iframes, right? Very, very strong. One of the strongest aspects of longsword is these iframes. Now, and that's pretty much it. Very, very simple build to use. Very easy to play. Not much to keep track of. Very strong, considering that, right? And that's going to be pretty much it for the playstyle. Like I said, it's pretty simple. So I do have a few things I want to cover before we wrap up this video. So I'm going to cover some important topics. These are going to mostly be for newer players. Let's go ahead and get into those. So as I get ready to wrap up this video, I do want to just once again mention a few very, very important things. First of all, reminder that you do absolutely need weapon techniques and weapon elements on your weapon. You need it on the weapon specifically. The ring does not work for this, unfortunately. Now, and that said, you can have a ring with that line on it, but it will not affect your avalanche technique. You have to have it on the weapon. Now, another few things. A reminder that the amulet and the charm slot are, and I guess the weapon subsets are the only places on your gear, or on this actual gear right here, where you can get critical hit chance on your secondary stats. Just remember to keep that in mind. You do definitely want to try to get crit chance on these and the weapon as well if you can. That's a little more difficult, but remember that your resistances are very, very important. I really recommend you try to aim for at least 50% in all your resistances. If you can, definitely try to get at least that much. Remember that your element duration of power, you want to get as much as you can, and you want them to be as even as you can get them. Reminder that if you include my Azure Fang Gauntlet, I'm at 362% duration and 364% power, for example. And other than that, just I guess a quick mention that helmet power and duration are by far your most important secondary stat lines. I guess if you exclude the crit chance on these on these pieces of gear right here, helmet power and duration will outscale anything else you can have for increasing your damage on this build. So definitely keep that in mind. Definitely want to focus on your helmet power and duration pretty much above everything else, except for crit chance for the sake of consistency. And that's going to be pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I feel like it's probably a lot better than the old version of this, plus, it's been updated since then. Hope you guys find this video helpful. Hope you enjoyed it. And I will catch you guys in the next video. Till then, take it easy, everybody.